Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us this morning. My name is Karen Tucker. I'm the CEO of the Churchill Club, a nonprofit dedicated to encouraging innovation, economic growth, and societal benefit. We've been operating here in the Bay Area since 1985. This morning's program is a collaboration with McKinsey Global Institute, which is the research arm of McKinsey and Company. We particularly want to thank Michael Chui, James Manyika, and Rebecca Roboy. The topic of our discussion is automation, jobs, and the future of work. Here's how it will work. First, Michael Chui will kick us off, and then he will call up James Manyika along with Reid Hoffman and Tim O'Reilly for a brief conversation about automation and what's possible. Then we'll be joined by the rest of our distinguished speakers, Martin Baily, Curt Carlson, Matt Slaughter, Richard Cooper, Laura Tyson, and Vivek Wadhwa, to debate the question, will technological advances automate tasks more quickly than we can create jobs? So please now welcome Michael Chui of McKinsey Global Institute.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Karen, and to our friends at the Churchill Club for helping to co-host this. This is a terrific turnout. This is 8 a.m. Friday before Labor Day, and we have so much energy in the room. So I appreciate all of you taking some time to talk about this topic, which, quite frankly, is not a new topic. There were people who protested textiles back in the early 19th century, you might recall. But it could barely be a more current topic, right? So, we see books such as our friends Eric Brynjolfsson and Andy McAfee writing The Second Machine Age. David Autor just presented a paper at the Fed Jackson Hole conference just last week. And then actually the Pew Research folks, an eminent research group, just recently released a poll that they interviewed a number of experts in technology, some of whom I believe are actually in the room. And the results were quite interesting. It was about 50-50. It was 48-52 as to whether or not robots and artificial intelligence would actually displace a significant number of jobs by 2025. So obviously it's a very current topic and terrific to find all of you here in the room. In fact, there are a number of people, Karen's remarked several times, we have a big panel. Which has been mentioned a few times to me. We're going to have a great conversation, but there are lots of people in the room who could actually be here on the dais as well, and so we're going to make sure we include you in the conversation. But why don't I invite some of our friends to begin this conversation. My colleague James Manyika, who's a director of the McKinsey Global Institute, Reid Hoffman, who many of you know is the founder of LinkedIn and now at Greylock, and then of course Tim O'Reilly, founder and CEO of O'Reilly Media.
What's now possible? I mean, you guys are both entrepreneurs, you're inventors, you've started companies, you fund companies. What's now possible in terms of what technology can do to automate tasks and activities?
Well, the first thing I would say, I always like to start with this wonderful line from William Gibson, the science fiction writer. He said, "The future is here, it's just not evenly distributed yet." So, yes, there's all kinds of science fiction things that we can imagine in the future, but we can also just look around and see what is happening today and then just extrapolate forward. And, there's certainly, I don't want to jump ahead too far into the discussion, but we're at an amazing inflection point where the power of computing is entering the real world. All of the next great round of Silicon Valley startups are going to look more like Uber than they look like, say, LinkedIn. Right? They're going to be things that, they will actually have a lot in common with LinkedIn. They'll have a big data science back end. And actually, I can actually argue even that LinkedIn is sort of actually now they think about it.
That's what I would have argued.
Yeah. You were maybe the first of that wave of just literally, using the power of sensors, big data, algorithms to actually go affect and change the workflows of tasks that we have done in the same way for centuries. And so, huge potential for disruption.
But one of the things that we've always thought, maybe Reid, you can take this, is that for a long time we thought that technology is going to automate repetitive tasks that could be scripted, But now we're starting to see arguably something quite different, where even what we do, the people in this room do, is starting to get impacted as well. Where does this stop, Rita? How do you?
Well, so I actually think if you look at most of the automation, it comes down to man-machine combinations. And all productivity does mean that each person, when you have productivity increases, each person is doing more, and so therefore the unit of number of people to do this amount of work goes down, right? But that then creates resources for doing other work. I mean, the most simple one was the transformation from an agricultural economy, right? We used to have a huge percentage.
41%, I think, of employment, right?
Yeah, was making food, and now it's like under 2, right? And so, and then they say, well, what happens with those 40% of the population? Well, they go on to other jobs. Now, the reason why this topic is urgent is, well, okay, does the exponentiating, Moore's law change the rule or not? There's always painful dislocation. Can we make that pain a lot less? Can we make this time cycle shorter? Those are the kind of interesting projects. Now, one of the things that I usually like to have people think about, and I love the Gibson quote, but I love to have people think about is that actually, in fact, we all kind of imagine it's like kind of like we have robots that are kind of the Asimov, and it's like and everything just happens and there's no other rule. Actually, most of the work moves to recombinations of kind of man-machine, right? So there's stuff that's happening in Uber, which is scheduling and availability and calling, but all of a sudden there's a lot more people, right, actually driving cars. The cost of it goes down in such a way that all of a sudden, and the convenience of it goes down in such a way, suddenly many more people can do it. Convenience goes up, such that you can actually, it becomes available for a whole bunch more people to do this sort of work in an effective way. Now maybe car manufacture goes down, right? Because now cars are being more efficient rather than like 2% or 4% utilization or whatever that number is. And I want to share an example. One of the things I learned from a recent trip to Shenzhen, because it's one of the most interesting manufacturing hubs. And one of the things I was stunned by in looking at the most advanced factory. We went to Huawei doing the manufacturing, and I was expecting, as kind of a Silicon Valley technologist, that it was kind of like a complete line of robots, right? It was like the whole thing would be automated because that would obviously be the thing to do. Roughly about 60% of it was automated and 40% of it was still people. And it's all a question of choice. You say, well, is that just because low cost? No. These are actually high-paid, high-skilled jobs. And the answer is actually because in the future, it's adaptability is key. And people are more adaptable. So when they set up the machine line, and it's all machine, it's actually a huge amount of retooling to shift it from line 1 to line 2, whereas the people are much more easy to shift.
Right. But let me push on that, though.
Wait. Can I
go ahead.
Back up a little bit to something Reid said earlier. If you look at this idea that it's a combination of man and machine, and you look at some of the examples that have really kind of surprised us in just how they've taken off, like Uber, like the Apple Store. They are actually cases where the humans are are made more powerful by their, this background, and that creates a better customer experience, which creates new demand. It's kind of interesting if you put Uber and the Apple Store in the same frame. They actually tell a very, very different story than the normal one of jobs are going away. Your typical walk into Best Buy, you try to find a salesperson. In an Apple Store, they swarm you. And not only that, they just totally say we got smartphones, we have real-time access to inventory. So wait, we don't we'll just have things on display. Everything's in the back room. Somebody comes up and they help you, they talk to you, and Apple's the most successful retailer in America, maybe in the world. So Uber, fantastic experience, because they basically use machines to give those drivers superpowers, relative to the old world. And I think that pattern we need to think through more often. And it really suggests that the experience is value add, and if it's actually a continuum really all the way down to the entertainment industry. I think ultimately, we are going to be focused on making better experiences for consumers, and that will not necessarily be automatable.
So let me challenge that, though, in the following way.
Yeah.
I have no doubt at all the experiences will be better for the consumers. Consumers are not the concern. But I'm trying to think about the employment side of this, because we've seen enough. I mean, you pointed out the fact that in manufacturing, we now employ, 10, 11% of the workforce, when it used to be much, much higher. So I guess what I'm wondering is, from an employment point of view, from a jobs point of view, will we have enough work for everybody? Because we have seen a compression. I mean, you've seen some of the work that shows that, for equivalent levels of output, we now are actually employing fewer people. But so will there be enough work for everybody?
First of all, there's some choice in that, what we pay people and what we consider the outputs. And I think Nick Hanauer made a really great point when he said, capital doesn't create, businesses, customers do. And if the customers can't afford our product, we're all screwed. We have to have a virtuous cycle where...
Well, I think he also said that capitalists love rich consumers and poor workers.
Yeah, which is a contradiction, yeah. But kind of coming... So there's some choice there in terms of how we do it. But again, looking at both these examples of the Apple Store and Uber, they're both increasing employment. Now, you might say, well, they're crappy jobs, and you're right. And there's some issues there. But I also think that will evolve over time.
Right. Well, I mean, Reed, you're on the board of Airbnb. I mean, you have all this class of new forms of employment, whether you call it the sharing economy, the peer economy. Is that the alternative?
Well, I think it's one. I think that the key thing, one thing that happens when you live in a kind of the networked age is actually the ability to have other kinds of distributed work, whether it's distributed transport like Uber, whether it's distributed hotels and spending the night like Airbnb, where all of a sudden, as opposed to kind of in a conglomerate of a hotel, an individual can say, hey, I'm actually going to rent out my room, I'm going to rent out my apartment. And the matchmaking of making that a facile marketplace actually generates a much broader set of participants in it. And so I think that's a contributory, I don't know if it's the solution, capital S, but it's a solution as part of a set of contributions. Now, I think that ultimately the real solutions to this come down to creating new jobs, right? And it's new work. It's not like saying, I mean, it's just kind of idiocy to say, well, all the jobs that exist today are all the jobs that are only kinds of jobs that will be 10 years from now. I mean, just look 5 years in history and it's different. So you want policies and you want attention to the creation of essentially scale kinds of companies in entrepreneurship, and you want adaptability in the workforce, right? And you say, well, what are the things we do as business people, as citizens, as intellectuals to help facilitate that? Right. And that's essentially the shot.
But on the point about adaptability, I mean, you must see this through what you see through LinkedIn, which has become a way to think about profiles and skills and capabilities. Yep. What are some of those adaptability traits or skills that seem to have a value?
Well, I think one of the key things is, like, for example, when you get into the sharing economy, part of what allows people to do is say, look, no one was raised in trained to be a Airbnb host, right? That's something you have to learn, right? And you go, well, actually, this is a way that I can actually add some income to whatever else I do. And actually, some Airbnb hosts actually, in fact, end up becoming that their main job. And by the way, there's even earlier variants like eBay. eBay sellers or another version of this. And so, like, I'll share a kind of an anecdote that I think is interesting. So the most booked spaces in Airbnb are tree houses. And so there's a set of hosts who realize that actually if I go build a tree house, I get a very good actually income stream from renting the treehouse. So if I can actually go and build a kind of like a little like equivalent of an apartment room treehouse, right, in my yard or with a view or something else, then that actually becomes a very robust way of investing and something as an experience.
Right, so you'll have effectively Airbnb hoteliers.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, eventually.
And that's the scale that you were talking about.
Yeah.
Is like, and that's the sort of thing. Now, I also think that there's value in programs like Udacity and other ones that are essentially going, okay, how do we help create micro training that can be purchased on demand? As I'm thinking, there's a lot of work going on how do you teach CS, in a most effective way through online. There's a whole set of things, and that's the kind. We want to be encouraging lots of them. I think it's a mistake from the reason I was pushing back a little bit about the solution. It's a mistake from the policy perspective to say, well, we put all of our eggs in one basket and say, this is the thing that's going to be I think you actually have to have multiple shots on goal.
Well, I also think it's super, super important to get away from the idea of the job. I have to say, it is the thing. If I could
by
change,
job, you mean what? Traditional employment with benefits?
I mean it in two ways. One, when we say we want to create jobs, it takes away agency. It's this notion that somebody has this thing and I will hire you and you will work for the man. That whole cultural, ideal, is an artifact. It's not written in stone. Like back at, when you were, a serf, you worked for the man and your aspiration was to own your own frickin' farm. And we're kind of like, a lot of people are there, they've been working for the man, and now they get to own their own business. You talk to any Uber driver, and if you guys ever try Uber, talk to the drivers, they will tell you, they love it. Why do they love it? Because they have agency. They can choose their hours. They can, when the business is slow, they take off and go do something else. Nobody's telling them how and when to work. I say, how much do you make a day? He says, well, my goal is to make $300 a day. I work until I make it, and then I take off. Whatever. They'll tell you all kinds of stories that are all about agency being what they love. But let me talk about the second part.
No, I want to test something. So you probably both saw there's a New York Times article about a week ago about somebody who's doing one of these multiple task activities, and the fragmentation that raises. Now, the point about bringing that up is because is it your view that everybody can do that? Can everybody be this kind of work entrepreneur that you're describing, or are there always going to be?
Well, that's a little bit like saying, can everybody be a super successful worker in a tradition? No, a lot of people are going to fail, whether they're getting a traditional job or whether they're getting one of these, self-motivated jobs. But what we set out there as our ideal, I think should be, first of all, so I said there were two things about work. The first is giving people more agency and the sense that they are responsible, that there's possible ways for them to make money, be entrepreneurial, that whole world. The second thing that I think is super important is to reframe the jobs discussion towards what work needs doing. And so much of the attention of the economy is the traditional thing is, how are we going to create traditional high-paying jobs? And then with startups, it's how are we going to destroy traditional high-paying jobs? We're going to basically cut the costs out of this. We're going to disrupt. But meanwhile, there's a lot of new things that need doing. And I think that the framing of what needs doing, what work is going undone, and I can give you a bunch of examples. We're going to have the demographic boom. There's teachers, volunteers, caring for the aged. There are going to be huge opportunities, and they're opportunities that are ripe to be the human face enabling. You think of a home health care worker who's able to be dispatched as needed, who can basically A, have agency, B, bring a human face to that job. Right. But we have to decide as a society that that's valuable work and that we want to pay for it. And we're not gonna say, oh yeah, crap, that's an expense that we want to get rid of.
Well, maybe let's end on this now because we're going to invite other colleagues to join the panel as well. Yeah. So Reed, what's your most optimistic scenario? So if you speculated, then I also want to hear the scenario that worries you the most when it comes to this issue.
Well, so roughly speaking, I think the optimistic scenario is, as Tim was describing, is that we don't just have also a creation of new industries and new jobs, which is essentially kind of full-time salary work, but also have the creation of a lot of different economic opportunities where people can be micro-entrepreneurs, they can do all sorts of things, and you have both with a lot of flexibility such that perhaps even more people overall succeed than before, even though not everyone succeeds at everything. Not everyone's a good software engineer, not everyone's a good entrepreneur, not everyone's a good micro-entrepreneur, et cetera. And that we can facilitate, because we're in a networked age, a faster ability to have that invention, to scale up and double down on the inventions that actually work, and therefore the notion of the kind of very painful dislocations, because the whole move from the agricultural age to the industrial age actually came with a super amount of pain too, is actually much softer and much shorter in terms of and that's what I think the optimistic scenario is. And I think the pessimistic scenario is, roughly speaking, if you begin to get a broad number of, essentially, we have a serious youth unemployment today problem, and so we have yet to have that be hitting there. And a large percentage of unemployed youth that don't view they have a future usually leads to some sort of civil instability. And so that civil instability can compound and could create reactions that then actually block out the optimistic future. Right? And that's at broad brush, those would be the two.
Well, now you get to debate that with some policymakers who can see how we make this work. So Michael, do you want to come up and introduce our other guests?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. You both stay here.
Okay.
We're privileged to be joined by another set of eminent guests, including 4 eminent economists and 2 other thought leaders from our local community. So let me invite up Richard Cooper, who's an economist at Harvard University, amongst his other achievements. Martin Baily from the Brookings Institute. Laura Tyson from Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley, as well as Matt Slaughter from the Tuck School of Business. And also Curt Carlson, who's the current president and CEO of SRI. And then Vivek Wadhwa from Singularity University. So please. Why don't we actually ask each member of the panel within 3 minutes each to actually comment on the question of the day, which is, will technological advances automate tasks more quickly than we can create new jobs? And Matt, because you ended up on the end, we're going to start with you.
So great question. I will assert that we will create more jobs in the future. Technology is not going to net displace jobs, create jobs. I say that based on a combination of history and hope. So the history was alluded to already by Reed and Tim. You look at the data on agriculture in the United States in the 1900s or the 1800s. Technological innovation in the US and many other countries for generations has displaced jobs, but on net, the wealth creation and income creation that comes from that creates a lot of new jobs. So there's good historical reason to think past will be prologue. There's hope that that will continue if we focus on the US especially, based on the fact that in recent years we still have these institutions. We have a deep kind of risk-taking culture, a lot of institutions about how markets work, especially capital markets, and a lot of public policies that have supported job creation in America. My hope wavers a little bit if I add the adjective good jobs, and our panelists have already picked up on that, and I think that's a really important question. We see evidence, it's quite clear in the US in recent years, that we're not creating enough good jobs. And so it's a question of, do people have jobs, but people care a lot about their W-2s. What incomes are they earning? And it depends on what data you look at, but all data in the US these days shows a sobering stagnation and decline of incomes for a shocking fraction of the US labor force. If you segment it by educational attainment, since 2000, 96.2% of the US workforce since 2000 are in educational cohorts whose total money earnings, inflation adjusted, have been falling, not rising. That includes even people with a 4-year college degree and non-professional advanced degrees. The only ones that have been rising are the PhDs on average, and then the professional degrees of the doctors, the lawyers, and the MBAs. So that's a little sobering if you think about it. We're going to create good jobs. And a big open question we'll probably talk about, and our panelists already rightly pointed to it, I think, is public policies. Traditionally, some of the best jobs in the US and around the world are in young, innovative companies, and also ones that find ways to get connected to the world. Global companies tend to pay much higher compensation. They tend to bring along a bunch of bundled things that generate high wages. And what we see, especially in the United States recently, is I will assert just a total stagnation in the policy arena on furthering policies through international trade, investment, immigration. Vivek has done a lot of stuff on this. Tax policy, investment in education, infrastructure. That makes me worry and makes my hope waver a little bit about whether they're going to create enough good jobs in the future.
Laura?
So I am with Matt on this. I said when I heard the question that I didn't think the formulation was correct, because we live in a market economy. Supply and demand ultimately determine the level of employment. So the number of jobs will be created, but the quality of jobs is a huge question, I think. If you look at what's happened in the 2000s, you got a statistic about the fact that most Americans, even during the expansion, 2001 to 2007, it's the only economic expansion that the US economy has had where middle income families actually saw no increase in their living standards. In fact, you had an acceleration of a decline. You had also a continuation of a trend which has continued through 2007 to 2013 of polarization. So the polarization thesis is well established out there. What's happening with the technology, which is skill biased and labor saving, is it's eliminating middle income jobs. It is complementary to the high skills in this room. So we all have jobs, and the jobs are high income jobs because some smart people have to work with the technology. But there is a very large number of people who are being pushed down into lower income jobs. And I think that is a reality that existed. It really started to manifest itself in the United States and in the European economies as well from the 1980s. So when we look at the experience of the 2000s, what I would say is, look, the decline in employment, the unemployment, was actually a macroeconomic problem, which we can get out of, and we are slowly digging ourselves out of it. The unemployment rate is going down. But the polarization issue and the job quality issue and the wage issue, there has been no evidence of any wage acceleration any place, which what Janet Yellen will say about that is, well, we have what a tight labor market in the United States may mean now in terms of wages is very different, and that may be in part because of the technology eroding good job opportunities. The second thing that's really important, it's been with us for a long time, is the growing gap between productivity and wages. So maybe we all agree that this technology is wonderful in terms of creating productivity growth in the United States. But as McAfee and Brynjolfsson warned in their book, let's say we all agree on the bounty of brilliant machines. That was their term. But their concern was also on the uneven distribution of the bounty of the brilliant machines. And you can see that in the gap between the productivity, a measure of the bounty of brilliant machines, and how it's being distributed in terms of wages. So those are my concerns. What I will say, adding to that, is people then talk about, well, we'll have to have public policy do the right thing. Public policy will have to help with the disruption of the workers. Public policy will have to help with the provision of a minimal standard of living. Do you know what's happened to the minimum wage in the United States? Come on, real inflation-adjusted minimum wage is down dramatically. If we had an inflation-adjusted, productivity-adjusted minimum wage today, it would be like $25. We would not be arguing about $10. So the point is that we can say, perhaps, we could lay out what we want public policy to do, create adaptable workforces, create a living wage, create a negative income tax, create a ability of workers to constantly up their skills, create jobs for teachers and healthcare workers. Those are all public policy issues. Do you see any evidence that that is the direction of public policy in the United States? I don't see it. So what I worry about is the machines are racing ahead. Public policy is, if anything, moving backwards. It's certainly not moving forward at the level of the race. So the policymakers lose the race, and a lot of displaced workers, a lot of American families lose the race. And that is my concern. Let me end by saying that one thing I begin to think about, I think it's important for all of us to think about. So we're talking about machines. Machines displacing people, machines changing the ways in which people work. Who owns the machines? Who should own the machines? Perhaps what we need to think about is the way in which the workers who are working with the machines are part owners of the machines. And the complementarity of their skills is also partly an owner of the machines. Think about all of our brilliant technology as a social capital asset, which every member of our society has a claim on. We are part owners of that social capital. Right now, we have a very bad way, no way, to distribute that more evenly. So I suggest thinking about it that way.
Thank you, Laura. Vivek?
I'm very optimistic about the future. I think that we're going to solve the grand challenges of humanity. We're going to have the cost of living drop dramatically so that the wage won't matter anymore. However, everywhere
Wage won't matter?
Wage won't matter because the cost of everything drops dramatically. Okay, so this is the change we're seeing over and over, and this is the advances that our technology friends are making happen. However, every which way I slice it, every industry I've looked at, I see a jobless future. There's no public policy we can create. Government doesn't even understand what's going on. No policy they will create will be able to educate the workforce. the workforce is not re-educatable as well. A 45-year-old unemployed taxi driver or factory worker is not going to be writing apps. He's not going to be using Uber and renting out his place. So every industry I've looked at, manufacturing, decimation, finance, decimation, transportation, decimation. I mean, healthcare, even doctors, decimation. Everywhere you look, we're talking about all of this happening not over 50 years or 100 years as happened in the past, or 200 years, happening over 5 or 10 years, 15 years, 20 years at the outset. So now the good news for America is that the next 10 or 15 years, we will be creating a huge number of jobs. Because even if we go to self-driving cars, we still need to now be setting them up. We need to be building factories to create these. We need to be building infrastructure. So short term, the future is very bright for the United States. However, China's toast. We talk about something which is a big, significant part of the economy right now, disappearing over a 5-7 year period. So what we're going to see is automation. Right now, manufacturing is trickling back to the United States. It's not rushing back because of the infrastructure costs, because of the difficulty in retraining a workforce. Give it 5 or 7 years, and that trickle becomes a flood. Give it 15 years, and now we have the robots going out on strike saying, stop the 3D printers, they're taking our jobs away. Because we won't need those robots like we do, because we will be able to 3D print stuff. 15 to 20 years from now, we'll be 3D printing electronics. So everywhere you look, everywhere you go, you're talking about decimation, decimation, decimation. We cannot retrain the workforce. In the past, we had entire generations of people unemployed. The factory workers trained their children, the children gained employment, they benefited. So the benefits came 30, 40, 50 years later. And we didn't retrain the old workers, we retrained the next generation. The education kept getting better, and that's how America rose. Now, within one lifetime, we're seeing change after change after change. We're seeing wave after wave of disruption. So I'm the optimist, and I agree with my technology friends, but like I said, I've been asking for the last 2 years, I've been asking people like Ray Kurzweil. Ray Kurzweil and I have battled over this. And he's silent now. He doesn't respond to my emails when I ask him to comment on this. But I've been challenging every other person I can. But no one can answer the question. Without doubt, there are no jobs. Now, what are the solutions? We can discuss that. But the fact is that we're headed to a jobless future.
Jobless future.
Thank you, Vivek.
Okay.
At one point, people on the panel wondered whether or not there'd be sufficient diversity in opinions. Curt, please.
Well, I also believe that we're in a world of abundance for the United States if we do the right things. I've never seen a time, not based on hope, but based on the reality of the number of things that are possible today. When I started my career, you look at various, we'd have maybe a dozen things we could work on that were significant. Today, take any field, biotech, infotech, nanotech, energy, healthcare, education. Everyone right now is wide open to revolutionary transformational developments. The only limitation we have is our ability to exploit them. That's the only limitation we have. So like Vivek, in the short term, meaning 20 to 30 years, I am incredibly optimistic if we do the right things. 30 years from now, I don't know, because by then we'll be bioengineering human beings, and goodness knows what that'll create in society. I have no idea socially. I can understand technologically what all that mean, but I have no idea socially what that means. I also agree with Vivek. He mentioned China. Whether China goes up or down, we're in a very competitive world. And we always forget about China. We say, oh, we're not creating jobs. Well, maybe there's a reason why. Maybe our social policies are from the 1950s. Maybe they're the wrong things. Maybe we're looking at the wrong symptoms. And we're actually, doing things like bleeding people as opposed to looking at the fundamentals, which is that we are not innovating at the speed of the economy. We are not adapting fast enough. I also agree with Vivek in terms of the fact that if you think about something technologically that humans do today, we can imagine a way to do it with a computer and with automation, with mechanical systems in the future. We're not going to have this big discrepancy. And they are going to have emotions. At SRI, we did Siri. So Siri is a trivial example of providing a service that some people find emotionally satisfying. Now, take that 20 or 30 years from now, when the computer behind there is 100 times faster than your human brain and has access to all of the world's information and understands everything about psychology and emotion, what is that world going to be like? It's going to be confused. Yes. It will be confused. Maybe we should keep the psychologists out of this.
A robot psychologist.
But just about everything you can imagine can be automated. Most of the jobs, even in this room, eventually will be automated. So, what does that world look like? It's hard to know. But in the short term, the number of opportunities we have in America is unprecedented. No country has the advantages that we have in terms of natural resources, ports, weather, you name it. But we have a couple problems that can destroy America. One problem is education. In our top 50 cities, half the minority boys don't graduate. They don't take algebra. They can't read a graph, so they can't even be an auto mechanic. They're completely left out of this world that we're talking about. They will not be creating apps for the computer. They can't do anything, really, in this global innovation economy we're in. In Detroit, the graduation rate is 25%. I always say, if an enemy did that to us, we'd go to war with them. We're doing it to ourselves. If 50% of the US population can't read a graph, do you know what America looks like? We can forget the jobs. We can forget prosperity, and we can forget national security. Now, the good news about that is that the technologies, there is good news about this, not that. The good news is, again, technology is beginning to create curricula that can transform education. Now, all the established folks are against it, of course, but they're from the bottom of America. It's now bubbling up, and people are transforming education in America. That's one huge thing we have to solve. A second one, which again Vivek has written about eloquently, is immigration. We keep the smartest, most talented, most passionate people out of America, when the only scarce resource in today's world are those smart, passionate kids. They're the ones who are creating the jobs. They're the ones who are creating the new companies. Small companies create essentially all the jobs in America, not big companies. They actually shrink employment. A smart immigration policy would be recruiting them in, like Chile and Singapore. I work with Singapore. They recruit the best people from around the world. We throw them out. How stupid is that? How stupid is that? It's wonderful that we can be.
A lot of people who can't read graphs.
We all
Yes.
know that.
Good one.
It's wonderful that we can let in so many poor people. But if we don't let in people who create the jobs and take care of them, again, America is lost. The last thing is, America needs to return to the idea of being the most competitive country in the world. Our competitiveness over the last decade has gone straight down. We now, thanks to Japan, we're number one in something in terms of competitiveness. We have the highest corporate tax rates now in the world. How about that? What do you think that does to America? Why do you think all those companies are leaving America now? Do you think they want to leave? They have to leave. We're not competitive. And if we don't change those three things, we will not have a prosperous future. If we do change them, the technology, the systems, all of that will be here to create the greatest period of abundance in the history of the world here in America.
But no jobs.
No, eventually they'll. I'm optimistic for jobs for the next 30 years.
No, 15
After
years.
that,
15
15
years.
Okay.
Curt,
Good
thank you.
job
Vivek.
now.
Martin, please.
My head is spinning a little bit, I have to say. I am struck by the fact that I work in Washington. Laura and I were
Right.
both in the Clinton administration together. I'm not on the inside of the current administration. I do feel, I was particularly feeling in the early part of this conversation that it would be great to have a better understanding of some of these issues in Washington. Now, some of the later discussion, which left me a little bit confused, I wasn't quite so clear about, but there really isn't, I think, as much understanding of the Silicon Valley environment, the technology environment, even the business environment, as there needs to be in Washington, and that I wish that would change. Now let me speak directly to the issue, and I agree with a lot of what's been said so far. Yes, technology is displacing jobs. It's been doing it for hundreds of years. It's going to continue to do it. Is the pace at which it's doing it increasing? I'm not sure, maybe, but it's certainly continuing to do it. Is the nature of that displacement changing? Well, I think it has changed, and this has been for about 30 years. So for a good many years, the new jobs that came along to replace the old jobs that were lost enabled people to continue to get good wages, to be good skilled, have good skilled workers. But now it seems like we have this uncomfortable skill-biased technical change where the folks that are able to be complementary with the technology, who knows how to use the technology, are seeing their incomes rising very rapidly relative to the folks that either just have a high school degree or have dropped out of high school and are really put in the position of working in a lot of low-income jobs. I was struck recently by learning that in one of our largest banks, the turnover rate for bank tellers is 50% a year. So being a bank teller now is no longer a sort of skilled job. It's no longer really a well-paid job. So we've had this change in technology. Obviously, we've put a lot of the intelligence into the IT system, so we don't need such skilled bank tellers, although if you ever go inside the bank, I try not to, but if you ever go inside the bank, you sort of long for the days when the bank teller was more skilled. But anyway, the banks obviously have decided, as have Walmart and many, many other companies, that it's more cost effective to use workers that don't have much training, that probably don't have a lot of education, although I think training is the more important. But instead to build into the production system the productivity, and they're very good at that. But it does create a huge number of not very good jobs, together with a set of jobs, the conceptualizers, the people that can take advantage of the technology, that have high incomes. So this has obviously created a problem of inequality in our society, and we're talking a lot about that. It's come to the head a little bit with this book by Piketty, although he's taking a view more of capital income versus labor income, although it is a concern about inequality, obviously. But also we're seeing that people who cannot get, or don't have the gumption to get, you can go both ways on this, a good job, are actually deciding not to work at all. So they're ending up unemployed, they're ending up on disability, they're ending up leaving the labor force. So in this recovery, and we're not talking about just the recent cyclical period, but it is striking in this recovery, the decline in unemployment has come almost entirely from a decline in the workforce rather than from an increase in employment. We are now getting a little bit of increase in employment, but it's been a dramatically different recovery than ones that we've had in earlier periods. Now, it's much sort of easier to talk about the problems than it is to talk about the solutions to those problems. The one that's always a favorite, particularly of educators, and I've been an educator, and is education. Why not? This is the home industry.
Go for it.
And I think education is important. It's not everything. I think we have a set of people in our society that do not do well in an education environment, in a classroom environment. I'm encouraged by the same things that I think you've referred to, that technology can change the nature of education. A lot of the problem is that kids get disillusioned. They feel dumb. They feel, why do I need this stuff? And a lot of them drop out, or they start college and then leave, or they start a high school program and then leave it. So it's partly a matter of motivation, and I think if we can change the way we teach, and our teaching institutions are moving very slowly, and they tend to move very slowly. So that's part of it. I think it's also perhaps a change in the way our businesses do their business models, so that it is possible to have a business model which involves lower turnover, more training, more complementarity between the worker and the available technology, rather than just displacing the worker or de-skilling the job to do that. And I think other countries like Germany, there are plenty of things wrong with the German economy, but I think they've done a better job on that score. And so we might do better on that side. This is probably fanciful, but after all, we are here talking fanciful things a little bit on this panel. Maybe there's a way we can have a technological initiative that could think about how we could change or adapt. I mean, we're not gonna take the technology from this direction to that direction, to change the direction of technology so that it is more friendly, more complementary with the mass of workers that we have that are currently not benefiting from that technology. And I don't know how to do it. I think it may be something that could require a government initiative, a research initiative of some kind that would do that. But if we could do that, I think it would make a difference, and you could actually see an escalation, because if workers that have been consigned to lousy jobs suddenly see new opportunities opening to them, then I think there's more motivation, and they are much more willing to seek out the skills. And finally, I think the things that have been discussed earlier, and we were discussing yesterday in our McKinsey meeting, of the sort of sharing economy where people become Uber taxi drivers, and well, it's only a certain number of taxi drivers we can have, but presumably the technology is going to create lots of new opportunities in that direction. And that is a way in which the workers who don't want to be at McDonald's, that don't want to be in these low-skilled jobs, can actually have a different choice as well. And so finding those different choices through the technology is what I would create the optimistic scenario. Thank you.
Martin, thank you. Richard.
Taxis are going to go away, by the way.
They're going to be displaced.
We don't use that term anymore.
Richard, please.
My name is Cooper. There was a time in which civilization was heavily dependent on coopers and potters. You couldn't carry water or store wine or olive oil without barrels or pots. Coopers and potters became technologically obsolete about 100 years ago.
What's a Cooper?
A Cooper is somebody who makes barrels and buckets. And they were absolutely essential, a highly prized skill.
You've done all right
throughout. Well, I was going to. I haven't finished my story. So the Coopers have become obsolete about 100 years ago. I am not unemployed. I decided to become an economist.
Oh my God.
Economists, as a group, as a occupation, at least under that name, did not exist at the time that Coopers and Potters became obsolete. And there is a lesson in this little anecdote, which is the jobs that are destroyed, and as Martin and others have said, jobs have been being destroyed for at least 200 years on a vast scale. And society has been complaining about the destruction of jobs for at least 200 years on a vast scale. They are very concrete. There are people in them, and the people who lose their jobs experience some hardship. The jobs that are created, and there have been lots of jobs created, we do not have 97% unemployment in the United States these days, which we would have if you believed the arguments that were put forward in the 1820s. We've created lots and lots of jobs. Many of those jobs are completely new, in new activities, new occupations, and so forth. So we run the risk, I think, of a fallacy of concreteness, worrying about the things we know about that are disappearing, and not taking adequately into account the things we don't know about, because there aren't people in the jobs that haven't been created yet. The Department of Labor, from time to time, records and then projects the various occupation skill groups in the U.S. economy. And I looked at it some years ago. I assume they still do it. I haven't looked at it recently. The most rapidly growing category of jobs in this large stub of occupations that the Department of Labor records was other. That is to say, categories that were not big enough yet to warrant their own line. And then, of course, under other, they did have some nascent industries identified there. And the most rapidly growing category of jobs in the U.S. economy over the period covered was other. And there's a lesson in that, which is, again, it goes back to the fallacy of concreteness. It's hard for us to imagine all of the jobs that are going to be created because they're new. Many of them are new. Not all of them are new, but many of them are they're in new activities. And what people forget is that when there are innovations that destroy jobs, and as I say, we've been doing that for at least 2 centuries, we starting in Britain, maybe 2.5 centuries, incomes are created for somebody else. And to close the logical circle, you have to ask what happens to those incomes. It's a very important part of the process. And the incomes may be spent, but if they're going to be spent, they have to be spent on something, and that something creates new jobs. We may not know what they are ahead of time, but that something creates jobs. Our question this morning actually concerns a timing issue, and it is possible that the incomes that are created by the new technology, the things that have displaced the jobs, are saved rather than spent. Well, we have something loosely called the capital market, and if people save it in a form that it can be socially mobilized, they put it in a bank account or they buy some equity or some bonds, then somebody else is going to spend it. Not the party who earns it, but somebody else is going to spend it. And once again, you get new demand and new jobs created with the new demand, although we're not entirely clear what they are until they actually materialize. There is a possibility that the savings can take place in a way that is not mobilized by the capital market. Just think of greenbacks under a mattress. So that and there are other more sophisticated forms of greenbacks under a mattress. So it doesn't get back into the income stream and does not create new jobs. Then we have what economists call deficient aggregate demand. And that's a concept that was introduced in the 1930s and 40s, played a very important role in our management of the Second World War. And we now understand it quite well. And if there's deficient aggregate demand, the government, our agent, the government, through monetary and fiscal policy.
You think our government understands this, Dick?
Can do something about. I know you did, Martin, when you were there, and Laura did. The point is that through appropriate macroeconomic public policy, I'm not now talking about the distribution of income issues and so forth, we're just total job creation. We actually know how to do that. Whether we can organize ourselves well enough to do it, that is not an economic problem. That is a political problem. We're all aware of the dysfunctioning Washington these days. But the importance of aggregate demand is absolutely critical to maintaining employment. And where the private market won't do it, and there are lots of mechanisms in the private market that contribute to creating new jobs, but where they don't create adequate new jobs, then we can do it through monetary and fiscal policy. That's how we close the logical loop. I do not see, there are many technologists in the room, but from my Olympian perspective, I do not consider the current changes in technology as fundamentally different under the heading that we're talking about as the changes in technology that have taken place over the last 2 centuries. Every era has considered its new technology absolutely revolutionary. Every era, whether you're talking about steam, electricity, chemicals, you can go through the historical pattern. And so I think it involves if I can put it that way, a burden of proof to argue that the next few decades, and my crystal ball gets extremely clouded after 20 or 25 years, is going to be markedly different in these fundamental respects from the past. I just want to close by noting one other thing which has not been mentioned so far. So the key point in my observations are first aggregate demand. The second is leisure. I visited Lowell, Massachusetts, which was the seat of the American textile industry for about a century. And until the 1880s, the working week there was 72 hours, 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. It's now officially, insofar as we have an official hour, it's 40 hours a week. It's been stuck there for 70 years. 70 years is when we first introduced the 40-hour week in the 1930s. And I think an important part of growing income, which technology makes possible, is greater leisure. And I think we need to be much more imaginative about introducing not only adaptability, as Reed properly emphasized, but also flexibility into the nature of work, into the working week, and including allowing people to define much more freely the balance they want to strike between leisure and work. I was pleased to hear about the Uber drivers who quit when they meet their target income. That's an example of greater flexibility in the work week. And so it's worth keeping in mind. Don't just look at GDP. It's worth keeping in mind as technology progresses how we dispose of our greater wealth as a society. And one of the perfectly legitimate and I would say sensible ways to dispose of it is through enjoying greater leisure. Leisure is usually complementary with at least some kinds of spending. And so again, new activities, new industries are created by greater leisure. Thank you.
Thank you, Dick. I know there are lots of people in the room who have 72-hour work weeks, too. Go ahead.
So I agree with everything that Dick Cooper, or I mean Dick Economist, had to say. So I'm not going to, kind of give you a prediction of whether we'll win or lose the race against the machine. But what I will say is the choices we make as a society are central to that question, to the answer to that question. It is not inevitable that any of these things happen.
Yeah, that's right.
And to give you an example of a choice that we make, we have an economy with a whole bunch of built-in incentives for cutting costs in businesses. Like if Clay Christensen's been talking about this a bunch lately. You look at stock-based compensation. You can actually lever your compensation in two ways. You can grow the business and you can grow its profits, or you can cut its costs, right? And there's a huge incentive for a lot of businesses where the people at the top will make a whole lot of money by cutting people down below, versus in the old days when that was not such a big part. The only way you grew your profits was by growing your business, by actually doing more. And the focus is now often much less on what new work can we be greedy about? Can we go out there and accomplish something in the world? And instead, it's like, what can we cut out of this thing to make it more profitable? That's a societal choice. We've got it baked in a bunch of ways, in terms of the way we run our businesses, the way we value our businesses. And those things some of those things are inherently destructive. People are human capital. How do we invest in the people who work for us? How do we figure out how to do more with them? What new things can we do once we have technology married to humans? And all of the great examples, I think, of companies that I admire are giving people new superpowers to do new things that they couldn't do before. That's one of the big opportunities in technology, is to make people more capable. And that doesn't necessarily mean what we think it means. When you look at, just take one of these little new economies, YouTube. First of all, it's an amazing educational platform. Where you can learn how to do anything. You want to cook a dish, some chef will show you how to do it in a 2-minute video. But more than that, you look at someone like, how many people here know about John Green? Do you know who he is? Best-selling young adult author. I think has 5 of the he writes books about pretty heavy-duty subjects, like his current bestseller is about 2 kids who are cancer survivors who fall in love, right?
Oh, yeah.
That's like, The Fault in Our Stars. But guess what? He also has a YouTube channel. And he is utterly beloved of young people. I mean, just, to give you an example, The Fault in Our Stars has something like 500,000 ratings on Goodreads, when he did a book tour, he sold out Carnegie Hall, right? So super, but he also does educational videos on science, on current events. His video on what the hell is going on in Ukraine, 2 million views, mostly by teenagers. That's kind of like somebody going, here's this guy from Iowa who has this superpower, which is given him by technology to be an educator, to be somebody who inspires kids. That's the kind of thing that technology can do as well as just destroy jobs. You can look at people who are, I think of my daughter who's an artist in residence at the Exploratorium. Everything she has learned to do what she does, she has learned from the internet. She's gotten this superpower, that's given her a job that she's created for herself. I think that we need to much more understand that we can do new things now because of technology. And we need to reward and idealize and idolize the businesses that do new things, that make possible new, wonderful experiences. So when we talk about Uber, we shouldn't be talking about the job destruction. We should be talking about what's wonderful about the new kinds of jobs that are created. When we talk about Apple and its success, it's like, wow, they figured out how to make this amazing object of desire with transformative powers, and it's a whole new economy. I mean, the size of that market is so much bigger because they basically made people more powerful. They made the devices more wonderful. I think there's so much potential in our future, and it's just waiting for us to go out and reach for it. You look at someone like Elon Musk. He wants to, go to space. He wants to build, the electric car network. He's not going to wait for a government handout to do it. He's bootstrapping that thing. These are people who are saying technology makes so much possible. Let's get on with it.
Reed. I'm supposed to follow that?
Sorry.
A lot that I obviously agreed with very strongly was just spoken. One little side note is, to some degree, Laura's idea of partially owning the machine is a lot of the Silicon Valley stock option part of this. So there's a bunch of that that's actually very resonant. And while there's a vast majority of stuff that Vivek and I agree on, immigration, entrepreneurship, I don't think the job-free economy is one, actually, just for what it's worth. But to amplify a bit on what Tim was saying, because the really key thing is the creation of the new. Because the only way that you actually get to kind of increase productivity that could lead to this savings, that could have it somewhat distributed so that you could have leisure time, et cetera, is the creation of new industry, new businesses, new jobs that come with that. And obviously the idea is to try to create a path, because it's always these fixed slice in time. One of the things that Tim was emphasizing earlier was that if you can have a path by which the jobs get better, the creation in terms of entrepreneurship can better, you can do something, you have that path, that's what's seriously important. And so when I look at that, it really kind of comes down to a combination of people and the ability to kind of organize entrepreneurially. And so with people, you've got education, which we obviously commented. I thought it was very funny that educators, that was a good comment. But education, but also the ability to actually just go out and make your own work, which is one of the things that Tim was emphasizing. And whether it's make your own work as an entrepreneur building a scalable business, make your own work, driving an Uber, and yes, there will ultimately be self-driving cars, and so all the driving jobs will in fact go away. There will still be other new jobs that are essentially created. And what I think that we need to do is think about how do we essentially amplify that. If you think about kind of the reason why I think we're all here today is because thinking about what we can do with public policy, trying to make sure that public policy is not retrograde but proactive, what we can do about business creation, what we can do about entrepreneurship, what we can do to take, because we do actually a lot of this kind of entrepreneurship here, and one of the reasons why I put a lot of effort into seeing how can you help find and create other kinds of entrepreneurial hubs in other areas of the world is really critical. And I guess what I'll close with is that one of the sidelights on why I think immigration, which has been one of our great competitive advantages in the US for perhaps our whole existence as a country, is because to some degree the immigrants who take the big jump of coming here, especially the ones with high-end skills and everything else, but it is a very entrepreneurial activity. And that aligns with what we want in entrepreneurship, is that sort of creativity, that sort of bold jump. And so the retrograde actions and policies, particularly coming from Congress, has been seriously a kind of a way of shooting yourself. And so with that, I think you've already heard enough from me.
So there's selection bias in immigration. I'm going to come to the audience because I actually want to bring people into it. But before I do that, why don't I very quickly go down the line? If you had one public policy recommendation in order to either keep the jobs from being automated faster than they have to be, or to make sure that we actually create more value, what would it be? And let me start this way and just go down.
So
just
one that I wrote about in the Washington Post a few years ago, essentially unlimited H-1Bs, same proof that you're not cutting the salaries, and a 10% payroll tax.
I don't have any thoughts on public policy.
I have lots of thoughts on public policy, which cannot be condensed to one answer, because I think you need a package of things.
Yeah, I'd buy that. That's probably a better answer.
I somewhat agree with that. I'll say that you have to make it attractive to produce and employ people in the United States. So the package of policies, which is taxes and skills and so on, has to be there. So it has to be a package, but the focus has to be on, hey, we can't just tell companies what to do. We've got to make it attractive for them to be here.
Curt?
Yes, everything starts and ends with people. So creating an environment to attract the best people, to keep the best people, and educate the best people is where everything starts and ends. Without that, we're gone.
Vivek?
There's nothing government can do here, I'm sorry.
Laura?
A little bit of a twofer, if you will. I think negative income tax situation, which is associated with a real minimum wage, a real income. We're thinking about the next 25 years. We need to think about a way to support people at a living standard which we accept as a minimum, given the jobless nature or the increasing jobless nature or the increasing quality-less jobs. I would also put on my list a reduction in the corporate income tax because, and it's an odd mix, but I actually think to try to get more activity in the United States, that's a powerful tool we can use.
Eliminate the corporate tax and a Marshall Plan for education, adequately funded.
Actually, I'm going to jump in with
All right, now you have an idea.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, Tim.
Something we could do.
Stop thinking about jobs and set some big, hairy, audacious goals for work that needs doing in the world that we uniquely can do as a country.
And when you mean work that needs doing,
I mean, it's anything from back when we said we want to go to the moon to we want to eliminate certain diseases, whatever it would be, but just some big things that are hard, as national goals. Think back, George Washington was the first one who said, hey, America can feed the world. That's freaking, our very first president had a big idea about our role in the world economy and what was a job that needed doing. And, it was a huge part of our economy for, 100 years after that, So we need to have some big ideas about work that needs doing.
Hey, that's the mother of all
energy
policies.
economy is one, obviously.
That's the mother of all policies. I thought you didn't believe in it.
Yeah.
Dick?
Well, I just want to push back on the corporate income tax. I think our current, this is going to be very unpopular in this group, but I think civilization depends on taxes. Everyone, not just Americans, has an aversion to taxes, but taxes are absolutely necessary. We want to be sure that they're sensible rather than not sensible. I think the corporate income tax needs to be transformed in cooperation with other major countries, much as California has done with the states within the United States. So we need to change the form of the corporate tax. I would not eliminate it because you have to raise or question where the taxes are going to come from if they don't come from corporations, and we know corporations do not always spend all of the money that they earn.
Thank you. Let's open. Oh,
All right.
someone has a question.
Yes, all right, let's hear from you.
Why don't we steer? Oh, hang on. Whoever has the microphone, please.
Hi, Peter Schwartz from Salesforce, and let me say I strongly agree with this end of the panel, Richard, Tim, and Reed. And I think the refs represent a failure of imagination. I strongly agree with this notion of intelligence enhancing every worker. It is the combination of computers and human skill. And I'll give you a concrete example. So I work for Salesforce, and there's a company called Cisco, that not the computer company, but the food service company. And they probably fed us this morning, right? They probably fed us this morning. This probably came from Cisco. Cisco has drivers, truck drivers, who deliver the food. Well, Cisco truck drivers today are more than truck drivers. They carry with themselves an iPad that has an enormous amount of intelligence behind it that make them managers of relationships, salespeople, managers of inventory, backup stream, developers of new programs, participants in R&D. They make them much higher capability. Did they have to be a whole lot smarter? No. There's an enormous amount of intelligence behind that, making it relatively easy for them to carry out higher value, higher skill, better paid jobs, in taking a truck driver and making him a much more skilled human being. So
Yeah,
I
but
think
the
what we're
wages,
talking
the wages of
wait,
truck
wait,
drivers
wait.
have been going down.
The
Well,
wages
these
are
guys are
going
getting
down.
paid
The
more.
wages are going down. Not your company,
From a
but
macro
overall.
point of view, the wages
And
are
a
going
truck driver
down.
isn't going to be writing these apps. He's not going to be working for Cisco or for
I didn't say they
Salesforce.
were going to write the apps. They're going to use the apps to make themselves
So the
smarter,
question
more
is,
capable.
What's he going to do?
He's going to make more money.
He's not. You don't understand truck drivers. Being here in Silicon Valley,
No
we're
offense.
cut off from the real world.
No
We can
offense,
create
Vijay.
jobs for ourselves. We'll have 100% employment in Silicon Valley and 0% employment in middle America.
Vijay, you're wrong. These guys have higher incomes. Sorry, that's true.
They
So
do.
they don't.
So what's the
do.
question?
They're small.
I'm
They're
sorry,
not.
you're wrong.
What's
So
the question?
what we're talking
They
about
do.
is being able to deliver using the technology
careful
of
of the
intelligent context through intimate computing, making all of these people far more capable. And I think that's what we're going to see, and that's how they're going to make more money. Now, in fact, I think the real issue goes back to something that was implicit that Richard said, and sadly, we've had bad economic policy for a long time at a macro level, not policy that favors job creation. We've had one political party that believes that you can't do anything in Washington. And Vijay, you're wrong. You can do things in Washington. And Washington has simply failed to do the right things because one party does not believe that policy can do anything. And so we have been constrained at a macro level. At a micro level, we can do an enormous amount, and many of the companies in this room are in fact making our workers far more capable with technology and able to earn a higher income and be more productive. Thank you.
Can I answer this question?
What question was that?
So I don't
Yes.
I don't think any of us would disagree with the fact that we're making workers more intelligent by giving them better tools.
Yes.
There's no disagreement with that.
Yes.
That's in the short term, absolutely. And our view is that we can argue whether it's 15 years or 30 years. I think changing infrastructure is harder than a 15-year task. But certainly that's happening. I would say, you mentioned that technology, really, the kind of thing we're going through today is similar to what we went through in the past. Well, I've been around for a long time. I used to work for RCA. I had the best projects at RCA, HDTV and the first internet company in the world. And it would take us forever to get that done, and we only worried about one or two other companies. And when we created it, we would create lots of jobs. We knew we were going to create lots of jobs. I've created about 30 companies in my career, been involved in them. The companies we form today have small numbers of people. They can be from 10 to 100 people, and they can wipe out 100,000 jobs.
Yep.
I've never seen this before in my life, that small teams leveraging the
It's
power.
because you haven't lived in the 19th century. We had innovations that wiped out thousands
He did.
of jobs.
Well, Richard, you didn't live then either.
I'm a student of history.
I'm a student.
Get some more questions.
Technology is on an exponential curve. There's a difference here.
Just jump in here with
a
the
quick
one. I
one,
think
Laura,
one of the
please.
reasons we were responding to you, Peter, is because, and again, I would go and sort of look at the literature on polarization. I really tried to emphasize we're talking about the speed up of the next round of computer-driven technological change, but we've been living with this for quite some time, and we can see what it's doing to the average income. We can see what's doing to the middle income. We can see people may find ways to, I'm not sure I go to a jobless future. I go to a very low wage job future, and that worries me. Vivek says no jobs. But
Few jobs. I'm exaggerating a little bit.
your anecdote is inconsistent with what 25 years of evidence, which says the middle is eroding, the top is improving, and the bottom is basically picking up lots of jobs, creating lots of jobs, but they're not jobs that will create the minimum living standard that we might, as a society, aspire to for our citizens. I mean, that's really the problem.
Thank you. Please identify yourself and please ask a question.
Thanks for the warning. Marco Nunziata with General Electric. So we definitely believe that the digital coming into the physical world of industrial machines is the key to what's different about this new wave of innovation. But my question to the panel is the following. First of all, don't you think that we are too quick at pointing the fingers at technology, partly because we've gone through the financial crisis? So some of the academic studies will show you that while we identify technology with unemployment and increase in income inequality, the dramatic increase in income inequality we've seen is limited to English-speaking countries. The US, the UK, to some extent Canada, Australia, not Germany, not Japan.
But
so
counting China.
Yes,
China, India.
yes,
As an English, honorary English-speaking country.
Right.
Soon to be the largest English-speaking country in the world.
We also know that in emerging markets starting to develop rapidly, it's not just China. That's a typical phenomenon of emerging markets where you see the initial increase in inequality. And I would find it hard to argue that Germany, which has a lower unemployment than before the financial crisis, and the same level of income inequality, it's not increased at all, that it has a fundamentally different level of technological change. The other question that I wanted you to reflect on is the following. It's to what extent globalization is playing a role in this? So to what extent are we seeing a re-equilibration of income levels globally that increases income inequality domestically? The second question is, why, I'll accelerate, but why do we worry? If we really believe that technology will automate all jobs, why do we care about education and immigration? Isn't it just an issue of the distribution? And isn't it the reason why we do care about education and immigration, that we fundamentally understand that human beings will find ways to offer new products, new services, and in fact, with the democratization of manufacturing, with 3D printing and other techniques, shouldn't we expect to see the rise of a new wave of artisan class, a new wave of artisan-like jobs that will create higher levels of incomes?
Thank you. I'm going to edit down the question. Mark, go ahead.
Can I just quickly respond, I think, on Germany, because it is an interesting case. First of all, I think in Europe, some of the same forces creating wage inequality are happening in Europe as well, and you can see it there. So I don't really agree it's just English speaking. No. Germany has done a good job with its training programs. It also is not a leader in the kind of technology we're talking about today. So it's perfected its ability to make machine tools, to make automobiles, and obviously it brings in a lot of advanced technology. But it's been able to use its skilled workforce in a way that makes it more complementary. So I mentioned earlier, I think that's, I don't know, we can't just copy Germany, but that's what we're looking for, is to make the technology more complementary so that it doesn't drive incomes apart, rather it holds them together.
Great, thank you. Jeremy.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Howard. I guess this question is to anybody except Vivek or Curt, because you say 15 years, 30 years, maybe jobless future. To the rest of you who do see jobs in the future, the question is, what exactly are they going to do? Before the Industrial Revolution, human beings did two things. They injected energy and they injected perception and judgment into processes. After the Industrial Revolution, they didn't need energy in the processes. That came from electricity and steam. So now we have most jobs involve injecting perception and judgment into processes. 3 years ago, for the first time, our computer achieved better than human performance at vision perception. Since that time, the error rate in perception has dropped by 1/2, by 100% effectively every year. We're now at a point where computers can see things 100 times faster, a single computer, than a person. In the last 6 months, we have started achieving the same in reading. Computers are now nearly at the same performance as humans at reading. So with computers getting to the point where they're now getting better than humans at seeing things and reading things, and they're already excellent at judgment, they're very good at processing multiple things, what exactly do you expect the people to be doing in these new jobs?
Great question, my friend.
But
you can't answer it.
Hal Varian has a great answer for that. He said, if you want to understand the future, look at what rich people do today. And you think about it, it's like Uber, everyone's private driver being a kind of a current example, or cell phones and how they came in and now everybody has one. But so I just sort of think of this in the context of Downton Abbey. It's like, here's a picture of what rich people did, right? They entertained their friends. They, looked after other people. And you kind of, that's actually not a bad economy. If we have the machines doing more of the work.
That's what you're worried about, Laura.
And we have the job of entertaining
with
each
no
other
salary,
and taking care of each other. Those are pretty damn good jobs.
But can I ask a question? Because I love this idea, but how do we then, not everyone, maybe if they all become owners of the equipment, as I'm suggesting, not everyone is going to be able to run their own little Downton Abbey.
Oh, absolutely.
No income
But like,
stream. Okay, so what exactly?
Yeah, go on.
The magic happens.
No, so I want to know.
I was going to say, it changes the kinds of questions we ask. For example, if it is like, okay, let's assume that we're going to get rid of a lot of jobs, then it's like one of the jobs of the job was to redistribute income, and then we can say, well, how else are we going to do that job? You suggested a great way.
One of the things that Eric says in the book, Eric and McAfee say, is basically, let's realize an essential feature of capitalism is the assumption that people get the income on which they live based on their work. That's an essential feature of the model we have. It's not feudal, it's not Downton Abbey, it's income and income from jobs. So this is, if you want to envision this future, we have to think about how we provide the income.
But think of the opportunity.
No, he's got to answer.
Matt's being very patient over there. We'll come back.
I want to agree with Richard on this. I don't think we can imagine what those jobs are. We've never been able to imagine what those jobs are.
right.
If you think about the long tail of jobs, the number of employees and the number of different kinds of occupations, I think what's going to happen is the top is going to go up because the markets now are going to be 7 or 8 billion people. So I can't even imagine what that means in terms of opportunities around the world. And with the tools that I talked about, where small teams can do incredible things, the long tail is going to become gigantic. It's unimaginable. People will be using those tools to invent all kinds of stuff. I don't think you can imagine the big things. Nobody can imagine the hundreds, millions of new jobs that will be created. That's why this other category is so prescient in terms of what's about to happen.
Matt, please.
So I agree that we don't know exactly what the occupation descriptions are per the other, but qualitatively, the Downton Abbey jobs, they're kind of non-traded personal services. And you see a ton of that in the US when you look at the occupation distribution data. But the other big thing qualitatively we should think about, and this interesting question connects back with the one about the rest of the world, is we can sell goods and services to the rest of the world. I think in an optimistic future, what's happened in the past, and you see this in dozens and dozens of countries, what determines that median wage has a lot to do with how much you're selling stuff to the rest of the world and interacting with the rest of the world, because globally connected jobs tend to pay a lot more. So whether it's an Uber driver for the next 5 years or 10 years, the question I have in my head is like, I'd put it this way, for the policy questions in the retrograde, I think it depends on your model, but it's kind of what that median voter in your country of interest thinks. The median voter in the US today, it's a 40-something-year-old male in Ohio. He has a high school degree and about 1 year of post-high school education. He's in a household whose median income last year was $51,017, and that's about $600 less than it was in 1989. Right. So there's not a judgment here, but I think the question is, a lot of us are enthused by all this great stuff. And so my question for the Uber driver, you give the $300 a day, I do the math. If that's revenue, gas and all this kind of stuff, maybe it's $200 a day. And if you work 5 days a week, that's about the median wage in America, household income for the year. It's about $50,000. What I don't know is how many of those jobs actually are there today for Uber drivers. And no judgment against Uber, but they're not technically employees of Uber, so it's kind of out there in the ether. And
But I would guess that if there are not now more Uber drivers than there are taxi drivers in America, there will be very shortly.
I don't dispute that, but my question is, what's their income? And then the question is, are we doing things per all the interventions, international tax, immigration, trade policy, to try to connect to the median income in China this year is only per capita income is like $9,000. India, it's like $2,000. The potential to do a lot of stuff, if we can connect jobs in Ohio to the rest of the world, then I'm really optimistic.
I want IBM's Watson to start replacing CEOs. Remember, they each one makes 1,000 times as much as a regular worker. So that'd be a big cost saving.
That's an awesome idea. It would also align incentives in a really interesting way.
My name is Jeff. Can you hear me?
Yes.
My name is Jeff Saperstein. I'm in the education space, so that'll be what I focus on. I want to build on what Reed and Tim and Curtis talked about. When I look at my first grade report card, they had something called works and plays well with others.
Yes.
That human interfacing has not been brought up here as the most important skill, given the fact that all making of things and even analysis of things is going to be easily mechanized, but the human interfacing part will not. So the question is, what is a job in terms of the future? Because everybody's using the word job as if that's 40 hours a week, and even an Uber driver, jobs can be really played with. And I'm just going to use one example. I was on the phone this morning with an IBMer in Miami who said, my father-in-law is going into, he has Alzheimer's, we have to put him in a home. I spent the last 2 weeks with my wife trying to figure out what to do. That means I've killed everything from my work. Now, the tragedy of that is if you multiply that over millions of people who are trying to be caretakers, or, by the way, be pregnant. By the way, you get fired for being pregnant because you're not going to be putting in your 90 hours a week at a place, at a consulting company. So the inhumanity of workplace and the fact that caretaking is not a job, and it's not compensated, is a huge public policy issue. And if people could actually, this goes to what Tim was talking about, if being more human and taking care of each other, I don't mean taking care of each other in terms of being a high-priced waiter at a restaurant, but in terms of what the human needs are, we could do enormous things with that as part of what a job is, taking care of each other and being paid for it. The other is, what is functional education, Curt? You're right. And at San Francisco, I taught at San Francisco State. Most of the state university employees are functionally illiterate. Their memos have to be rewritten. They don't know how to write, frankly. But does anybody in this room doubt that if Google were assigned to create a gamification program to teach functional literacy, that you could take those 50% and have them functionally literate enough to be able to get a job? I'm sure we all would agree if Google were assigned to that, they would find a way to do it. Elon Musk has said that he could build the light rail system for 1/3 of the cost. Does anybody doubt that Elon Musk, if he were tasked to do that, would be able to do it? And that when we're looking at these massive layoffs, you were talking about the country. When you're looking at coal miners in West Virginia, you're talking about whole swaths that are becoming third world countries in which we are looking at something where they're not able to participate in the high growth economy. And I think ramping on with using technology in terms of some of that taking care of each other and functional literacy that enables people to participate in the economy are two areas that really should be explored.
Thank you.
That's my question.
Response, please.
I want to respond to that. I agree on the caring. And one of the things I said, and it disturbs me a lot, is I think technology is racing forward. We may not be able to envision what people do. But right now, public policy is not racing forward. And my concern is that policy loses the race. So a lot of good things have been said here today, and I don't see any of them from a public policy point of view happening. And I'll just go to caring. We are the only advanced industrial society that does not have child care and family leave and paid family leave. We don't give a damn. Basically, it's the family's problem, and most of the families grappling with that problem are headed by 1 or 2 minimum wage workers who are trying to deal with caring. So yes, I think it's a wonderful idea. Are we moving in that direction? No. And I do worry about in the race with technology, we're losing the public policy battle. This is also true on education. Education, my negative here would be technological change has been a major driver of wage inequality. Wage inequality has been the most important driver of income inequality, not capital. Income inequality is highly associated with inequality of educational opportunity. Where are all the problems in education we're talking about? They tend to be in communities that are low-income communities with very poor schooling. So basically, how are we going to get at this unless we deal with the inequality effects of educational opportunity, which in part are being driven by the technology itself?
Can I just push back just a little bit in one way, and that is that despite the public policy problems, we have passed the Affordable Care Act.
We did,
and I
yes.
know it's, the implementation
I
was
agree.
lousy, a lot of bugs in the system.
I agree.
But I think we're on our way to universal health care, and that is a huge equalizer, something that we needed to do. So I think that does go in the opposite direction.
I completely agree, Martin. I completely agree.
So I just say one point. In America, and probably why Vivek said what he did about the government, we meet people at the base of America who are solving these problems all the time. And you don't find that if you go to Taiwan or Singapore or Sweden. It doesn't bubble up from the bottom. And we get to meet those people. For example, on the education stuff, we have a curriculum to teach algebra. 50% of children, as I mentioned, disadvantaged kids flunk algebra. With our curriculum, essentially almost 100% of the kids pass algebra because it's based on the latest advances not only in education but digital sciences. We're now engaged in the biggest trial, I think, in the history of the United States, 100,000 disadvantaged kids in Texas to try out this curriculum. We're not the only ones. It's a whole zeitgeist that's going on right there. Training for adults. People don't adapt at the speed of technology. You made that point, Vivek, today. That's a really huge issue. Can technology address that? Probably, but it's still in its infancy. I think we can see solutions to these things, and the problem with policy is because it is so slow, it's usually fighting the last war. It's not looking at where the world is going and what we need, 5 years from now. And once it's in place, we're stuck with it.
Matt, quick comment, and then I want to get another question.
Yeah, so when I say a Marshall Plan education, if the policy wand is magic enough and I can wave it as much as I want to take Curt and all those kinds of innovations, and then I'll think about your kids, your grandkids, or kith or kin. Think about the education you pay for them, either through the homes in the public districts you live in or the private education. If we wanted to scale that for every kid in America and then do something similar for workers, my only general point is that costs an awful lot of money. So yeah, I want to get rid of the corporate tax, but a lot of us are going to have to pay a lot more in taxes to pay for that.
Can I make a comment about education? I'm in a field, I think of what I do as education. I publish books, videos, conferences for people to train themselves on the skills of the future, in the technology industry. And the thing that's so distinctive is the education is self-motivated because people want to do something.
Yeah.
And the biggest problem with our educational system is that the curriculum is based on some abstract idea of what the knowledge is. We need to make our curriculum as well as our public policy based on what do we want to do, and empowering kids to get passionate about doing something. And then what do you need to know in order to do those things? So I think we need to have a lot more work in school as well. Teach kids to do things, and they will learn the skills that they need to do those things. So it goes back to this idea of we need to understand what we want to do as a society. What things, so like caregiving. We really care about that, so we're going to have that be part of our schools. We want people to be able to build things. So We want people to be able to run a business. Well, how do you start to get that into the curriculum? I tell you, all those poor kids, they know how to run a business, right? Because they're drug dealers, right? If you're a drug dealer, if you're, you fucking have figured out how to deal with money. You've figured out how to be entrepreneurial. The fact is, we haven't given them a good
far too
alternative.
much over here on these things. This is not right.
What?
These kids are not drug dealers. There might be a few of them, and
no,
most of them
I
are
get
not
that. No,
entrepreneurial.
I just mean, though, the skills, like when you have a task, you learn the skills that are needed to do that task.
But you should feel better. Karen could have a whole session on what's happening, what you asked for around the world right now.
Mm-hmm.
Thousands of programs to address exactly that. Real programs with real people, with real entrepreneurs who are addressing these issues, and with great exemplars now. It's what you said. It's just not evenly distributed, but it is out
happening.
there.
It's absolutely happening.
Next
Not
question,
enough.
please.
Okay, Viv Anand, former McKinsey, Bear Data. So I see people skirting around the issues, but I don't know if it's too much of a political hot potato. No one wants to address it. But what about the issue of population? I mean, we're talking about creating jobs for people. It's a global economy. We need global jobs. I know people talk about American jobs, which is fine. At some point, it's going to affect us. But how about, what about controlling population? And, do we just expand population to no end? But what are we doing about that? Do you think it's a factor, and is technology going to help in any way?
Yes, for sure.
Demographers.
No, I don't think we should be controlling the population. As I think many of us have said, it's not really that we don't have enough jobs. It's that it's the distribution of jobs that we're ending up with is not very good. But actually an economy that's growing a little faster, has a certain amount of population growth, a certain amount of productivity growth, actually easier to create jobs, I think.
Globally, my solution is the fastest growth that we can have around the world. Accelerate growth through innovation. The reason is, as soon as per capita income gets to about $10,000 per capita, population drops like a rock. Visit Taiwan.
Right.
They have a fertility rate of 0.9. Exactly. 2.3 is replacement. That means in one generation they go from 22 million people down to 8 or 9 million people. It's death. If you go to, even the Black Death was not that fast. If you go to Japan, it's true. If you go to Japan, there's no immigration, and they peaked about 7 or 8 years ago, and you can begin to feel it now.
When the US would be the same without immigration. If we didn't have immigration, we'd be declining also.
That's why we need it. We ought to get the bright ones here too, right?
Richard.
Well, that point has just been made. The world population growth reached its peak in 1963. Great rate of growth of population, and it's falling actually very rapidly. It's falling differentially. And there are parts of the world, mainly sub-Saharan Africa and part of the Arab world, where it hasn't fallen. But everywhere else, it's fallen markedly. And again, there's a policy dimension. We have a proscription in our legislation on helping other countries that want to do it, in family planning. So there's a policy screw up. But I want to push back on the education issue a little bit. Americans bitch tremendously about their educational system, and at its worst, it is abysmal. The main characteristic of American education, compared with most other countries, extreme decentralization. Extreme decentralization. I vote every other year for the Cambridge School Board, which sets policy in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a city of 100,000 people. Extreme decentralization. So we have a huge variety. But I am a student of, I'm talking about K through 12 now, not universities. I'm a student, a casual student, I have to say, of education. I now think I know something about the education system in most of the other major countries. I do not know Finland, and Finland seems to be doing something right, so it's on my agenda to learn about Finland. But I would not trade the American education system for any other major country. Not for any other major country. I know that's a funny thing to say, and I think that many of these people in this room are actually products of American education. In most systems, education is passing the received wisdom of the past to the next generation. It's more or less a one-way flow from the teacher to student. We start encouraging our kids to ask questions in the first grade. And I think a large part of the capacity and interest in innovation in the United States actually starts at preschool and elementary school. It's a fundamentally different philosophy of education, and I wouldn't trade it for any other one. Now, can we improve it? Of course we can, and we ought to look for ways to improve it. But I don't think we should sell ourselves short in terms of the educational system that we actually have. At its best, it is unrivaled. At its worst, it's terrible.
Thank you. Actually, if I look around the room, there are lots of people who I know were not educated in the United States. Please.
Mike Lebo from the Institute for the Future. I want to thank all of the people who are concerned about the policy initiatives, and I think I agree with most of the initiatives I've heard about reforming education, tax policy, investment in education. But policy is almost a lost cause. So Tim, it falls back on us, our technology community. And I thank the Churchill Club for convening this meeting, because I haven't seen many discussions on this topic in the Silicon Valley. So I want to ask Tim, the impact on people's jobs of our technology and entrepreneurial work in Silicon Valley is huge. But it's implicit. It's just a byproduct. Nobody is starting companies with the effect, with the idea of improving productivity and creativity, except maybe you. You know, you and Dale launching the, maker fairs and so many hackathons. But I want to ask you, Tim, to comment on how we can actually get our community, the technology community of Silicon Valley, to kind of shoulder up to the responsibility, since the policy guys are really struggling with some almost insurmountable barriers.
Well, first off, I would say I actually don't I think the technology community is doing a pretty good job. I want to start out with another comment about policy, though, which comes from Mike Bracken, who's the head of the UK Government Digital Service, which is a fabulous technology organization in government. He said, we don't have a policy crisis, we have a delivery crisis. We have, here's the thing, you think about healthcare.gov. We even had a policy that, many of us think was going in the right direction. But we utterly failed in its delivery in the first implementation.
In the first implementation.
Yeah. And one of the things that I think technology can do is help us actually implement our policy.
Absolutely.
And that we need to get better at getting more people from technology to help. And that's kind of what we do with Code for America at the local level, and what these new groups like the United States Digital Service, Mikey Dickerson, who was one of the key people on the healthcare.gov rescue, is now running something called the U.S. Digital Service out of the White House. Todd Park, who's the U.S. CTO, is coming back to Silicon Valley, but still remaining working for the White House to recruit technologists to come actually help us put technology to work, making it possible for us to deliver on these policies that we're, because we're still kind of trying to govern with 19th century techniques, 20th century at best, in a 21st century world. And so one of the things I would just urge, technologists to do is to actually get involved and help with policy delivery and help with government.
Thank you.
Jonathan Gruden from Microsoft Research. I'd like to read one sentence from this book, The Shape of Automation for Men in Management. That was published over a half century ago. It was published by computer scientist and economist Herb Simon before he won the Nobel Prize for economics.
Right.
And the sentence that he wrote in 1960 is, technologically, machines will be capable within 20 years of doing any work that a man can do. And this is completely characteristic of what technologists have been saying since before 1960. And my message is, do not believe anything that a technologist tells you about what will be true in 15, 20, or 30 years.
I'm having a reflexive problem with that. You're at Microsoft Research, right? No, not about the company. Not about the company. About the job. Sorry.
I just want to respond to that, though. In some of these cases, we are not talking about what technology will do. It is what technology is doing. A lot of this commentary is sparked by actual, real world things that are happening today. Yeah. And even just those things continuing to spread, not necessarily new magical technologies, I think.
It was like AI. We thought AI was dead. AI is everywhere now. So these technologies have happened.
The city of San Jose. I just wanted to contribute what I think is an important perspective, and that is that despite automation, I think you all need to realize that manufacturing is once again a growth industry in Silicon Valley. Brookings institution showed, an hour south of you, you have the most concentrated, significant capacity in high-tech advanced manufacturing capabilities any place in the nation. And we have regained 60% of those manufacturing jobs that we thought we had lost. And we have good production jobs that are going begging for people to fill them. And what's causing this is this extensive contract manufacturing services capability, which is tied to new product introduction. So whether these big global corporations or startups, when they want to learn how to produce something that's never been produced before in an environment where their intellectual property is being protected, that's happening right next door to them in Silicon Valley. And also because of automation, we've seen the reshoring of jobs in manufacturing from China we never thought would come back. So the conversation is a lot about national policy, but the local level, I think, is where the action really is. So we are working through a new entity called the Silicon Valley Manufacturers Roundtable on these issues of how can community colleges produce not the specialized craft technicians, but those basic people with computer literacy, digital literacy, numeracy that can take those jobs in our corporations. We're trying to make manufacturing sexy again, right? With the youth and students, bringing them into manufacturers for internships so they actually think about it as a career. We're fighting to protect land use from being changed into housing or high-rise offices because we still need it for this advanced manufacturing capability. So there's a lot of things that we're doing at the local level, and manufacturing is a growth industry. 1 of every 5 people in the southern part of the Silicon Valley is doing something related to actually making things. So as we have this convergence of software and services, it all needs to ultimately be embodied in a device or a thing. And it's alive and well. And I think people don't really appreciate this.
Any comments?
Yeah, I just commented. First of all, I applaud what you're doing, and I know Brookings and McKinsey are both looking at advanced manufacturing and bringing jobs back. The only question would be on what scale is it really happening? Because what's tended to be, particularly in advanced technology industries, is that most of the design and all that stuff stayed in the United States, but the actual manufacturing went overseas. And manufacturing jobs went way down like that. Now they're starting to climb back up very, very slowly. So yes, I think it's great, but we're not going to get back to where we once were on manufacturing. I just don't think that's realistic.
The jobs won't be there, but the manufacturing will come back because of automation.
The activity will, or some of it will. Some of it will.
In spite of my reference to Coopers, I actually started my life as a farmer.
So now you're a farmer, Cooper?
And my own view is, not just in the US, but worldwide, manufacturing is going the way of agriculture, which is that productivity will go up and up and up, and employment will go down and down and down. We, with less than 2% of the labor force, approaching 1.5%, are a huge agricultural exporter in this country. And I think the same thing is happening in manufacturing as we substitute machines for people. And by the way, it's not a matter for regret. Best thing that happened to me was getting off the farm. And many of these manufacturing jobs are actually terrible. And they should be the faster we can substitute machines. That's a harsh thing.
Some of them were good jobs and ways that were an access to the middle class to a lot of people, and that has been one of our problems, that those jobs have disappeared.
No, but many of them were repetitive and dangerous. They paid good wages because the American automobile companies were extracting rents from the American public. The American Steel Company, through protection, were extracting rents from the American public. And this is a harsh thing to say for the people who are in those jobs, but it gets back to the fallacy of concreteness. If one is talking about the evolution of a country as a whole, I think we have to reconcile ourselves. And for me, it's not a matter of regret, of declining, as we've seen, declining share. And by the way, of manufacturing jobs, as in agriculture, and not just in the US. This is happening worldwide, even in China.
Yes, it is.
Matt, did you have one?
Well, my last name is Slaughter, so our family, no.
My name is Bruno Rembe. I work at Google. I have two questions. Our panelists, a number of them have actually said that part of the solution is through policy and allowing better immigration, getting qualified people in the US. Can the solution be a US-only solution? I mean, creating jobs here, fixing the technology disruption and creating jobs here, will it work if jobs are destroyed elsewhere in the world? Will that actually work? The other question I have is, a lot of the discussion has been around technology will create new jobs, and it's jobs that we don't know about, but they're coming. But the only example we hear is about Uber and Uber drivers. So I'm slightly kind of curious as to what else is out there, and is the fact that we're constantly mentioning this one example a sign that the ratio isn't right? We're destroying lots of jobs, but there's only a trickle of new jobs which are coming in.
You know, here's the problem with Silicon Valley. All we think about is Silicon Valley, about high tech, about trust us, we'll make it good, let us get rich, and everything will be fine. It won't be fine. We are devastating China's manufacturing industry now. There will be hundreds of millions of people worldwide unemployed. What's going to happen to them? So this is a real issue. Whether Silicon Valley will be fine. We'll be creating more jobs. We'll have more gazillionaires over here. But we will have poverty in other places because of this.
Well, I just want to comment just to avoid a misunderstanding. My point, and again, it's historical and future, is not that the technical changes will create the jobs themselves. They will create higher income, which will lead to the creation of jobs, perhaps in very different sectors of the economy. So it's important to keep your eye not just on the technical change, but on the incomes generated by the technical change and how those incomes are spent.
So can I say something to that? There are many economists' points of view on this. Most economists would almost overwhelmingly agree. Surveys show on Dick's general view that technology, we can't predict the jobs of the future, but we live in a market economy. There will be employment. The wages will fall to where they need to fall for there to be employment. So there's agreement on that. Economists disagree in surveys on the quality of the jobs. Actually, almost half of the economists now surveyed say they're worried about the quality of the jobs that come from this technological revolution. So I think it's important to distinguish always the number of jobs and the quality of jobs. Dick talks about the income created by the technology. One of the more sobering and controversial pieces out there that many of you might have read is Robert Gordon's prediction that we're going to have a much slower 100 years going forward than 100 years past. And part of that is because the very small fraction of the income created going to the bottom 99%. And that is going to change the demand growth of the economy, and that is going to change, therefore, the dynamics of the economy. Remember, as somebody said, capitalists want rich consumers and cheap workers, but there's a tension there. There's a tension there in terms of demand and income.
Professor Slaughter. I'd be careful with this conclusion. These are all things, the results of doing other things. And when you list them, it doesn't go back to why are wages going down? Why are we having these problems? And it's because we're not innovating fast enough, we're not keeping up, we're not adapting.
I think there's very good, well, let's say that there's a debate on this. There's the best evidence, I think, it's not about that.
Yeah, I agree there's a debate. I'm just saying, if you look at from the point of view of someone who creates jobs all over the world, I have a different perspective on the opportunities and what we're doing. I wanted to just put a warning on what you said, that, it's true that China's going to have massive problems going forward because of their population decline and because of these global trends. But again, the warning is you can't anticipate all the jobs that will be created in China either. Right. And don't think of it as a world of scarcity. If you do the right things, it can be a world of abundance. And the media always talks about scarcity, scarcity, scarcity because they can't think of the things that are going to take their place. To me, the key thing is if you do the right things, if you empower people the right way, if you create the right economic incentives, you create the opportunities because people naturally want to do it.
Thank you. Isn't there a question of timing? And we're talking about different generations.
Yes, different generations.
People who lose their jobs today,
yes.
Will they be the ones who are able to kind of jump back and make it happen? Or is it their children? Then there's a lost generation.
That's my biggest worry in this whole puzzle.
That's absolutely right.
Matt?
I just want to pick up the first there's been a lot of great questions, but the first one you asked was quite interesting. CEOs and leaders of companies, young and growing, large in advanced countries, what they say when they think about the emerging markets, a lot of them about the challenges that are there, they talk about things like market access, national treatment, IP protection. And so those are things that are inherently not US-only issues. So they're issues that require policymakers to be able to kind of coordinate. If you think about other big issues like global warming and things like that, it's going to be lots of countries, hopefully, magic wand waving, trying to set up a policy framework that allows jobs in one country to be connected to the rest of the world. And so my friendly amendment to what Tim said earlier about it's wonderful for people to think more about trying to help implement policy. But I think the gap where we need more vision and imagination is the leaders creating those policies. How do we try to get those countries to do better things?
Can I bring up a point there on policy that's super important lesson from Silicon Valley? One of the biggest things that Silicon Valley has learned in the last 20 years is how to experiment and fail quickly. How to, the whole lean startup movement is defined as a startup is a machine for learning. It's how do you actually put out the smallest possible product and learn from it, implement, increment, implement, increment. And you think about, for example, the failure of healthcare.gov. Somebody had a policy, they specified it enormously, and then it was very, very hard to implement. Anybody in Silicon Valley would have built that thing up incrementally. And I think the thing that I think we need to do is have much more experimental policy rather than somebody going, oh yeah, we figured it all out. It's like, how would you run small policy experiments that you scaled up?
Yeah.
When you saw it
One reason we have 50 states, actually, is to experiment at the state level in policy.
But even there, they're still tend to be massive experiments and lots of things glommed together, so they're very hard to learn from.
I promised this group that we would let them get off to their Labor Day weekend on time. So I'm going to finish with a lightning round, which is a quick question and quick answer from everybody. I'll start, Matt, with you. What job is most surprisingly at risk based on these trends?
Policymakers.
Laura.
I won't say economists. I will say lawyers.
Vivek.
Practically every job that you can find is.
Curt?
Right.
Yeah, I kept on going through a whole list in my head.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many of them.
Yeah,
there's so many.
Martin.
I thought lawyers too, if you can regulate in such a way that you can achieve that.
Dick.
Oh, I think lawyers will benefit no matter which way we try.
He's a pessimist.
They're the ones who write the legislation.
Tim.
Boy, that's a tough one. I love the idea of replacing CEOs with Watson.
What job is surprisingly not at risk?
The human face of care.
Well, I already mentioned lawyers.
Caregivers, we're going to need a lot more caregivers given the demographic distribution.
Curt?
people like Mozart.
Vivek?
The coach, the mentor, the guide.
Laura?
Caregivers.
Nursery school teachers.
What country or countries will these effects be most prominent that we've been talking about? In what country?
United States.
United States.
U.S.
No, China's toast.
Remember China's toast. Takeaway.
Well, I think it's
toast.
America should be by far doing the best.
Yes, I agree.
Well, I think they'll first be evident in quantity in the United States, but these are worldwide phenomena.
Sure.
And so they will. It's a question of timing. They will spread. Since China's the biggest country, India will be in a decade and a half. That's where the biggest impact will come ultimately.
I would say the Middle East, because we're already seeing in the Middle East, what happens when you run an economy the way we're running our economy, where you have a large disenfranchised class at the bottom. So we need to worry about our future, because if we don't change the course that we're on, with a whole lot of people out of work with no hope, we're going to end up with a lot more bottom-up
Suicide
trouble.
bombers?
In what company would you invest based on this discussion?
It's you probably haven't heard of them. None of us have.
I have never been a stock picker. I have very high confidence in the adaptability of the American economy. So my basic view, it was my strategy, has been very successful so far. Bet the American economy.
That's right. Broad portfolio of stocks. That's right. That's what's done well by me.
Plastics.
It's very local, very local. Vivek.
I would do a portfolio of exponential companies focused on exponential technologies.
That's a good answer.
Yeah.
I'd follow the index, but I like Alibaba, despite China being toast.
Prediction is hard, Vanguard.
All right. And finally, what would you advise a student to study today? Matt.
Emotional intelligence.
Laura.
Engineering.
Just learning how to learn, learning where the knowledge is, learning to reinvent themselves.
Curt.
I would get a quantitative background of any type and then find a mentor and learn everything you can about innovation and entrepreneurship and go off on your own and not depend on anybody else. Develop those skills.
Martin.
Well, my kids have done well doing all kinds of different things, but I think being an economist is pretty good. So I recommend that.
Develop at a young age a very strong mathematical background, and then I agree with the comment, given that, learning how to learn, because adaptability, as Reed said at the very beginning of today's session, Reed said adaptability is critical for the turbulent future that we're going to have.
Tim?
Learning to work hard.
Terrific. Thank you all. I appreciate it. Thanks for the discussion.